This is IAQ Radio, Indoor Air Quality Radio, the voice of the indoor air quality industry, with your hosts, Radio Joe Hughes and the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. And now, Radio Joe Hughes.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to IAQ Radio Plus. This week is episode number 568, and joining us is Doctor Jill Crista. We're going to talk about diagnosing and treating mold sickness. Before we do, let's thank our platinum sponsor.
IAQ Radio Platinum sponsor is John Don Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at jondon.com. That's JONDON.com.
I also want to thank our gold sponsors, Particles Plus, Healthy Indoors Magazine, Gray Wolf Sensing Solutions, and AEML Inc. Laboratory. And, of course, our association sponsors, CIRI, the Cleaning Industry Research Institute, the Indoor Air Quality Association, and the Restoration Industry Association.
And now you can win a cool prize. It's time for the IAQ Radio Trivia question. Be the first to correctly answer. Simply email your answer to czlotnick@cs.com. Or if listening live, just text your answer from your computer. And now, here's the Z-Man with this week's IAQ Radio Trivia question.
Hello, everyone. Congratulations go out to Adam Lesko, Green Environments Consulting, Inc. in Springfield, Massachusetts, and Doug Conan, Aerotech Environmental in Dayton, Ohio, who combined to identify 6.6 gigatons as the quantity of concrete consumed in China between 2011 and 2013. Comparatively, that's more than the U.S. used in the entire 20th century. The IQ Radio Trivia question for today, Friday, December 20, 2019, has been sponsored by Ideas, the solution chemistry company, providing unique solutions to odor removal, surface cleaning, and decontamination problems. Here is today's IAQ trivia question. What event led to the first use of the term mycotoxin? Back to you, Joe.
All right, Cliff, very appropriate for today. We've got Dr. Jill. Dr. Jill Crista is an author, nationally recognized speaker on neuroinflammatory conditions such as brain injury, mold illness, and autoimmune encephalitis. She earned her Naturopathic Doctor Degree with honors from the National University of Naturopathic Medicine in Portland, Oregon. And in 2012, she completed the physician training program with the International Lyme and Associated Diseases Society. For over a decade, she was the director and practicing member of 2 integrative clinics offering naturopathic medicine, integrative medicine, acupuncture, chiropractic, physical therapy, craniosacral therapy, that one's a tough one for me, and massage. Welcome, Dr. Jill.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here. I feel very lucky to be able to share with you guys.
Great to have you. I almost made it through your bio with correct pronunciations, and then he got me on the last one. What is that? Craniosacral therapy. What is that?
Yeah, it's basically where it's like gentle chiropractic to the brain and the spine. The sacrum, so the lower part of the spine and the brain. And the idea is that it keeps the spinal fluid flowing and helping the brain drain as it gets used.
Interesting. I could probably use a little bit of that myself here. All right. Well, let's get back to the topic for today. First, I guess you call it naturopathic. I call it naturopathic. You said tomato, so I'm glad we're both, correct, I guess, on that. How did you get started in the naturopathic medicine world?
So when I was in college in Wisconsin, I worked at a really fun hippie store. It's near just a half hour from where I live. I liked to mountain bike at the time. So they had like natural food and herbs, and I got to ride my mountain bike on the trails, and I started working there. And one of the people that worked there was a master herbalist. And when I was behind the desk, people would come up to me and they would ask me, what herb should I take for this or that. And finally, the clincher was someone came in and said, I have liver cancer. What herb should I take to get rid of my cancer? And I thought, don't ask me. I don't know anything.
Wow.
And it made me realize there's a demand for this, and it was an interest of mine, but I didn't know how to learn about all of these plants that this woman who I was working for could just pull things off the shelf and make a formula and send people out the door. And I thought, wow. I said to her, wouldn't it be amazing if you could become a doctor that knows about all of these things? And she's like, was right out of the movie. She ran back to her office, brought this big thick binder, and it was full of dust, and set it down. And again, like the movies, you can just hear the boom, and then dust went. And a friend of mine at the time owned an herb tincture company. And it was one of those things, she said, just open it. There's all these resources to learn. I always wanted to go to one of these schools, but I never could. And I opened it up, and the page I opened it up to was my friend's herb company, an advertisement for that she had clipped out of a magazine. And at the bottom of that article about his herb company was an advertisement for the school that I went to. And just like that, I made the decision. And I think had I done a little more homework, I don't know that I would have made the same decision, because it's a lot of debt and a lot of work, and it's medical school. So, but I've never regretted it and never looked back.
Well, did you do pre-med at Wisconsin or biology?
Yeah.
Okay. So you did your pre-med there and then went to Oregon, it is, for the naturopathic?
Yeah. So there are 6 naturopathic medical schools. So you go with your pre-med done, and then you go to these medical schools, and you learn, the first 2 years are pretty much the same as a standard medical school. All the anatomy, physiology, you do cadaver lab and all of these things to learn about the body and the things we know. And then the last 2 years are the therapeutics. So I did learn some of the body things in a more holistic way, where normally that isn't happening in a conventional medical school. You don't hear your EENT instructors say, now remember, this might have to do with something going on with the tooth. They might have a tooth infection, because that's in the dental class, so there was a lot of just in a mind keeping the connections together.
You take that holistic approach. We teach that when we talk about indoor air quality investigations, looking at homes in a holistic manner, and that sounds like you did the same thing. Now, as far as the mold end of things, was there much discussion in your training on mold-related illness?
There was more than, I think, in a conventional medical model. We had environmental medicine courses, and so it was taught there. So I had that network or that framework that told me that mold is definitely a formidable foe. It's both an allergic problem and a toxin problem. So I had that foundation that then when I was finally able to identify that the patients in my practice that had mold, I had the foundation to go and know what to look for in the research and know that it's more than an allergy. It's more than an allergy problem. And
as far as how did patients naturally come to you because you're an ND with mold-related issues because they weren't getting, I guess, satisfactory answers or treatment from their MD?
No, that's the problem with mold, because as Dr. Shoemaker taught, that it can affect every system in the body and cause almost any symptom. Most of the people that were coming to me had just pretty severe but chronic illness that was vague and no one had an explanation for. And as a naturopathic doctor, you can rule out a lot of the common things. And most of the time when you find the cause, treat the cause, and, I have very motivated patients, which is so fun about being a naturopathic doctor. People come to me knowing they're going to get homework. They're going to get a good diagnostic workup, and they're going to get homework. And then their job is to get better. Not me as some, overarching omnipotent power that I'm going to bestow health on them. And I give them information and identification of the problem, and then they get to go do the work. I say get to, because I try to frame it positively. Yep. But these are some serious things they have to do. They have to change lifestyle, diet, when to go to bed at night, when to turn screens off, how to breathe. It's amazing how many people don't know how to breathe. So there are lots of things that I send them home with. And most of the time, the majority of the time, once you identify, a food allergy or something in their home or, something like that they have power over, they get better. But then I started to attract Lyme disease patients because Wisconsin is a hotbed of Lyme disease. And that's a more complicated condition to deal with. So you have to add some antimicrobials and some herbs. And I had another group that got better once we identified it was Lyme, but then this other set of stuck patients, we had ruled out everything, their thyroid health, their gut health, their infection burden, and they're still sick. And in one of those patients, they found toxic black mold in his home. And I started to research a little more because I had that foundation of it's an allergy problem and it's a spore problem and a mycotoxin problem. I started getting into the research and realizing, wow, mycotoxins, they're really the majority of this condition called mold illness. Yet we're only teaching, the CDC defines it as basically spore illness. And as I dug into research, I realized, wow, these other Lyme people that aren't getting better, I think they might have mold. And this was before we had mycotoxin testing. And because I'm not shoemaker trained, I didn't have the shoemaker panel, dialed in. I did it through naturopathic means, diagnosis, looking at the data points on regular labs that you can look at and identify that mold might be a problem. Started to treat it, and these people responded. So that's how I got to mold. And it was really a slow, over a decade-long process of now becoming expert in it and known for it in my area, where then that's what I always got was the Lyme, mold, PANS patients, because that's what I'm kind of known for seeing results in. And that's why I wrote the book, because I thought, our job in medicine, those of us that do mold, is to help people identify when it's mold, because most of them don't know that it's mold.
Interesting. Cliff, did you have any follow-up?
Not yet, Joe. Thanks.
Okay, I do. You piqued my interest with the breathing thing here, and that we don't breathe correctly. I don't know if that was your exact statement or not, but I used to do some breathing and working with people on breathing. Maybe you could explain. I think it's important. What do we fundamentally get wrong about breathing?
That is such a good question, especially when it comes to mold. What we get wrong is we don't inhale down into the belly. So the most blood or oxygen picking up blood that's available in our body is in the lower part of our lungs. So if you're just breathing up here, just enough to kind of get to survive but not thrive is what I call it. You want to be breathing down into your back and let your belly stick out. And, in our culture, that's all about beauty and being thin and that kind of thing. Like, people they hold that area too tight. And so they need to just allow that area to expand and to bring the air in. But here's mold's Jedi mind trick is it affects our breathing when we're asleep. It starts to affect the brain chemistry. So that when you're sleeping, you can actually get apnea if you have mold sickness, because the brain starts to not feel the need to breathe. The other thing that mold does is our bodies are wise. They know that they're breathing in these toxins and particulate matter and things that aren't good for it. So you start to underbreathe when you're awake. So I see breathing as a really important part to restore health, because oxygen that's our main fuel. Like, if you think about the body and what we need food, water, and air. You can go without food for 30 days and still survive. You can go without water for 3 days and still survive. You can go without oxygen only 3 minutes. So that tells you what's the most critical nutrient that we need to be taking in.
I also find that people don't focus enough on exhaling. Yeah. And if they exhaled properly, they would inhale properly, because you have no choice. If you push all that air out of your lower lungs, then you have to put it back in. So very interesting that you mentioned that. I think it's fascinating. It's something that a lot of people could learn from. So, all right, let's get into the diagnosis on mold, because, people have trouble differentiating sometimes between a mold-related illness and, like you've mentioned, sleep apnea. I tend to think that, some people don't really have, they have sleep apnea, but it may be because of other exposures, whether it's mold or other, particulate-related exposures. How do you go about differentiating between someone that has a mold-related issue and some other health issue?
So it's tough. And in clinical practice, because you see people with chronic illness that have been sick for so long, sometimes it's the having an illness for so long that's creating more illness. So what I did in practice, since I was started in the Lyme world, Dr. Horowitz created a Lyme questionnaire that sort of gives you a needle of, is this probably Lyme or is it probably not? And so I took his lead and created that for mold for myself in clinical practice so that I could kind of quantify, could this be a mold-related illness, or are these symptoms something that I haven't investigated yet? Again, like gut or food allergies or glyphosate or, mothballs or other toxic illness issues. Maybe they work in plastics manufacturing and they're getting all of those chemicals as they breathe. So it helps me sort of identify, when am I possibly looking at a mold sick patient? And I put the questionnaire in my book, and if anybody wants it, they can email me. Actually, there's a tab on my website. If you go to drcrista.com/questionnaire, you can get the questionnaire and then you can test yourself. Because it is really difficult to say this one symptom is diagnostic of mold. There aren't those, because mold will affect everybody differently depending on your nutrition status and your genetics. There isn't one keynote symptom. Although I would say that most of the people that I work with that are sick from mold have some level of anxiousness or unsettled, which may show up as insomnia for one person and may show up as restlessness for another. So, that kind of increasing or upping the amperage. Oh yeah, that's the quiz too.
John has pulled it up for us. Yeah. So here's, go ahead.
Yeah, this is just my quick quiz. If people are just curious, if you're listening, you're like, I wonder if I'm affected by mold, they can go to moldquiz.com or go to my quiz on my website. But if you go to, you have to enter it in for the clinical questionnaire, because usually that's just doctors that want that. But more and more as I've been talking to people, they're like, no, I want to score myself. I want to find out if this could be a problem for me. So you have to do drcrista.com/questionnaire. It'll get you that questionnaire page, and you can get a downloadable questionnaire. The nice thing is for if you guys are working with a family as a remediator, and they're taking the questionnaire, they can take it after the remediation is done and they've started treatment, and it gives them a marker of remembering how bad it was. Because that's the beautiful thing about humans. We're a little bit like golden retrievers, like, oh, it's fine. It wasn't as bad. We kind of have a short-term memory for pain, which is a good thing. It's a protective thing. But often when I was in practice, I would say, wow, you're really progressing. And they would look at me, no, Dr. Jill, I still feel terrible. And I'm like, let's look at the last questionnaire. And they'll notice that 3 or 4 symptoms are no longer a problem, but they forgot, because when vague, irritating symptoms go away, you don't notice. You only notice when they come. So it's a fun thing to track your progress along the way.
Interesting. John, if you could put that back up real quick, I just want to see some of the key, maybe point out some of the key questions. Oh, sure. He's moved on to the next one already. John's always a step ahead of us here.
Yeah, when you put your email, it should just instantly send it to you. Follow my tech in. And then you can download that PDF if you're if you like to write. So I'm working with different practitioners and hospitals to try to scientifically validate this questionnaire and tweak it so it becomes a real effective tool, because mold is so hard to identify. The key things that I see are fatigue, anxiousness, like I said, and it's not anxiety, that's just restlessness, an inner sense of things aren't okay. I also see gut-related issues, so someone will come to me with like a irritable bowel kind of thing, or maybe constipation and bloating. So the gut is usually involved somewhere. The sinuses are usually involved. Did I hit them all? And then something neurological. So ear ringing or pelvic pain, or highlighting a neurological thing that you had already. So it might be that you had sciatica, but it only ever acts up every so often. Pay attention, were you just in a musty smelling environment after that or before that event?
You mentioned ear ringing, and I believe I have tinnitus. I've never been diagnosed with it, but I'm pretty sure I have it. How is that different from ear ringing, or are
Same
they
thing.
similar?
Same thing. Yeah.
Same thing.
So one of the class of drugs that are classic for creating ear ringing is antibiotics. And if you think of what antibiotics are, they are mold toxins. So the little, the bread that Louis Pasteur, the little green thing of penicillin that he grew, there was this ring of sterile area outside of that. And that's what we use for the antibiotics. And that's actually a mycotoxin.
Zone
So,
of inhibition.
yeah, it's just amazing. And all the microbes are always at war for holding their own space. And, people ask me, I can go off on I want to explain to you where I'm coming from with my approach to treatment. It has to do with that understanding of how the mycotoxins or how the microbes all can either live in a healthy, happy, supportive biofilm, or they live in a pathogenic biofilm. And that's what is happening with the water damaged building, is that it's almost like it's too many resources. So the molds come into the environment and they have lakefront property where they normally wouldn't necessarily have that. And bacteria want a piece of that. There are some parasites that want a piece of that. So there are these, this fight of the microbes to sort of gas bomb. You guys already know this, gas bomb the other ones out of there. The problem is that when human biomes are exposed to those toxins, it turns our normal flora, which normally, if you tested healthy people and sick people, you'd find almost the same critters. So it's not the critter, it's that the critter has now been turned into feeling like it's under threat. And now it's going to start acting pathogenically in its normal environment. And that's why, for me, I think that treating the sinuses and the body with antifungals is critical for getting your health back.
We had Dr. David Corey on the show a while back. He's from the VA down in Houston, and he does he takes sputum and he has a way of culturing it that apparently it's tough to culture sometimes and find these fungal infections in sinuses. Do you use something like that to help diagnose a fungal infection?
Yeah, it's a little difficult to find a lab that will work with you to culture long enough. So that's one of the challenges, that doctors will do a postnasal culture and they're not comfortable to get. You have to it's like a flu test. If everybody's had that, you have to kind of push, a tube way back, and then you push a little saline, you suck it back up. So it's not comfortable for the patient. And then if you're sending to a normal lab, the lab won't necessarily be looking for the cast of unusual characters, and they won't necessarily be using the medium that will grow out that character or culture it long enough. So yeah, I think Dr. Corey, I hope he gets farther with his work and can publish some things so we can create some standards of how to test for these critters in the sinuses. But I get a lot of flack on the sinus treatment. People are like, well, if you tested normal people, they would have all those guys in there too. We do actually see Aspergillus occasionally in a healthy person's sinus, but they're not creating mycotoxins. So the Aspergillus is just sort of there in a passerby kind of way, but not trying to establish a home.
Interesting. Why you're working on getting a group of people working together? Why don't we see more cooperation between? I've had I probably had 10 or 12 different MDs, NDs, et cetera, on the show. And it seems like it's tough to have everybody working together. Do you have any idea? Am I wrong on that, or is it changing? How are you trying to help change that?
Yeah, I hope it's changing. I think that those of us that have been doing what we're doing, when you're getting success and you're seeing really sick people, you're so busy in what you are doing that you forget to teach others. So that's why I created a practitioner training course, because I stopped seeing new patients to make space. So I think part of it is just overworked doctors. And then those of us that have been in our littler communities, or maybe our tribe, like for me in the naturopathic world, they know I'm an old lady. But in your tribe, you can get kind of beat up about talking about something that doesn't have solid human studies. So unfortunately, there is I think, a concerted push to suppress human studies on mold. So I am having to do translational medicine on my own without a study that says, okay, this worked in animals. I have a high confidence level of safety with this plant or with this nutrient already through my training and my experience. I'm going to try it for this mold sick patient and then see if it brings me results. And that's basically how I've been experimenting on my patients, but it's informed experimenting. But that's how I developed those protocols, because there aren't a lot of human studies. So it's easy to pick on me. It's easy to say, that's not proven. That isn't shown in any kind of human study or human trial. It's like, then prove me wrong. Let's pay for some studies and prove me wrong. So I think when you get beat up a little bit, I think that makes people a little defensive. So I think we all, now with ICI, the ISEAI, I know you talked with
Yes.
Dr. here about that. Now with some of these more integrative sort of organizations, it really fosters a space for us to share what's working and to help support each other. Like, I'm perfectly fine with someone that knows a better way to do this. There is no one protocol or approach that's going to work for every patient. Like I said, I have very motivated patients. They know when they come to see me, they're going to get homework. Not everybody is up for that. So not everybody can really put up with the protocols that I'm putting them on. Yeah, there's ICI.
Yeah, I was trying to remember what that stands for, the International Society for Environmentally Acquired Illness. So you're a part of that group as well?
Yep, and also the NAEM. That's where I come from, the world of naturopathic doctors. The beautiful late Dr. Walter Crinian taught me about mold. And that NAEM is another organization, and that's started kind of out of the naturopathic medicine world. So it's been very collaborative and sharing and that kind of thing. But I don't think conventional medicine hasn't really fostered that approach, and it's changing. It's really neat to see. So hopefully things will move more quickly now.
Got it. Okay. NAEM, National Association of Environmental Medicine, John.
And they have a conference called the EHS, the Environmental Health Symposium. So if you do EHS, NAEM, that might be easier to find them. But yeah, that's where I started. That's, when I first started practice, and I was seeing, in my area, we see a lot of lead toxicity, because we're in a lead belt right here, and I was seeing mold and Lyme. And so I was reaching out to some of these teachers to say, okay, what do I do now? So yeah, I would love more research, human studies on mold. Be great.
Well, isn't that hard though, to get human studies? I mean, aren't there ethical concerns to some degree, or?
Well, not when you're using things that are so safe. The nice thing is that in the protocol that I'm using, that I'm finding very effective, I rarely have to go to a prescription drug. So these are things with a very high safety profile. They've been used for eons. The most dangerous thing on my list is old man's beard, or usnea, that can cause some liver problems if you take it continuously. So in my protocol, I use it for a period of time and then gives people a break, then period of time on and off. So that's really kind of the most dangerous thing that I use, and that has already, eons of use and high safety profile. So I don't see what the limitation, I think, is just money and support of our philosophical support that these things actually work. But people have been sick from mold since biblical times. That people, it's written in Leviticus. It's described there. That wasn't only they didn't wait around until they had a drug. They had things that they used.
They had to do something. Now, what other labs do you do, if any? I mean, do you use just a questionnaire? Do you also do some labs with people? What are your thoughts on maybe the visual contrast thing that Dr. Shoemaker uses? Just looking at diagnosing a little bit more before we talk about treatment.
Yeah, so for diagnosis, I try to get as many data points as possible, because there is no single test either that says, oh, this is definitely a current mold issue. And so I will use, and I'll just back up on that, the idea of the person who's exposed to a water damaged building, those toxins in the air, or dust, air, small particulate, that turn on the survival mechanism of the sinus and the gut flora, and skin flora. For a lot of people, they get skin rashes.
Mm-hmm.
When that gets turned on, then we can see urine mycotoxins. We see mycotoxins if you lavage the sinuses, you'd see mycotoxins in the lungs. But the urine is a pretty standard and low invasive way to find mycotoxins. The problem is that doesn't tell you, is it a current problem or a past problem? Because it could be something where they were exposed to a water damaged building. It turned on that survival mechanism, and now you have your own internal flora fighting with each other. So that's one limitation of the urine mycotoxin testing, although I do it. And I have a handout that I give to people before doing it, because the one limitation of that is if you have eaten something with mycotoxins, then you potentially are looking at what's reflected in that person's food. I do believe, though, that there's an overemphasis on food intake in order to not pay for somebody getting their house remediated, or I think that's a push by people who don't want to pay for or recognize that there really is something called mold illness. So what I do is I have people for 3 days go off the foods that we know are the most moldy or mycotoxin filled and beverages, and then try not to have them do anything that's going to cause a disruption to that test before we take the test, to try to get the best information that we can out of, minimize the limitations and maximize the strengths of that test.
What are those foods and beverages, if you could, real quick? Sure.
So beverages are easiest. I'll start with kombucha. Any alcohol, so beer creates, it is a yeast byproduct. So, we're going to see gliotoxin and things like that. So alcohol, kombucha, and moldy coffee. There's a problem with some coffee. So making sure if you are having your coffee, make sure it's been independently tested that it is free of mycotoxins. And then the foods are some of the things that either get moldy in storage because of our mass production of food. So that would be corn, potatoes, peanuts, and grains. And then getting rid of foods that are mold themselves. So no cheeses, no mushrooms. And so for those 3 days, that's kind of the diet I have them go on, so that I know that I've minimized to the greatest extent the limitations of that test, or minimize that argument.
What about milk?
What about milk? I don't know about this.
Okay. I'm just curious because I know they test milk for aflatoxin because it comes from cows, and I didn't know if there was enough aflatoxin in milk to maybe skew the urine test.
That is a good question. I mean, potentially if you are dealing with a producer, some of the foods that are moldy, then we know it because the animals are eating the moldy food. Some of those things are tested and regulated heavily enough that I don't worry about them. It's the sneakers, people don't think about potatoes and corn. But in my area, this fall, there was a big pile of corn and it was pouring rain on it, and they just put tarps over the top. I thought, okay, there's going to be some moldy feed, so yeah.
Plenty of that. We're past halftime. I've got to stop and thank our sponsors. And when we come back, I'd like to talk a little more about treatment and also about how you handle inspection and remediation of people's homes. So we'll be back in 90 seconds with Dr. Jill Crista.
IAQ Radio Platinum sponsor is John Don Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at jondon.com. That's JONDON.com. Gold sponsors are Particles Plus Engineers and Manufacturers of feature-rich particle counters and air quality monitoring instrumentation. Learn more at particlesplus.com. Count on us. Healthy Indoors Magazine, a free online digital magazine for industry professionals and consumers. Subscriptions available at healthyindoors.com. And AEML Laboratories, free FedEx shipping, great pricing, same-day results, and never a rush fee. Learn more at AEMLinc.com. Gray Wolf Sensing Solutions, who use advanced sensor software technology and embedded computers to provide superior environmental test instrumentation. Visit them at wolfsense.com. Association sponsors are the Indoor Air Quality Association, a multidisciplinary organization dedicated to promoting the exchange of indoor environmental information through education and research. Learn more at IAQA.org. And RIA, the Restoration Industry Association, the granddaddy of the restoration industry. Network with leaders. Learn more at restorationindustry.org.
CIRI, the Cleaning Industry Research Institute. See more deeply through science and research. Learn more at ciriscience.org. That's CIRI science.org. All right, we're back for the second half of our interview. We've got Dr. Jill Crista. Before we left, we were talking a little bit about diagnosis, and I didn't want to cut short on that either. You mentioned the urine testing, and I know that can be controversial. And one of the things I've heard, and I'm not an expert on this by any stretch of the imagination, is that the laboratory that does this can also be important. Have you had different results with different labs?
Yes. Yeah. The way that I learned about some of the things that can interfere with the testing, like glutathione, can potentially, depending on the lab you use, it can actually augment or show a higher level than you really have, or it could show a lower level than you really have. So the way that I learned all of that is I've been doing my own split sample testing and experimenting. I'm working with a lab now to try to figure out some standards of practice so that we aren't left guessing in clinical practice. But the labs, my favorite technique for urine mycotoxin testing is mass spec, and there are a couple labs that do that because I think that's finding a more accurate result for me without having the person have to be so restrictive about what supplement they take or whether they provoke or that kind of thing. But it's really, I think the onus is on the labs to do some research and help us find out. I don't want to be funding that all myself anymore. That's how I've gotten to.
Pricey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What other labs do you do, if any? I'm just curious. Do you do any?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So like I said, I try to get data points and not spend people's money, too much of their money. But so the VCS test is really useful because it's inexpensive. They can do it from home. And then I also do a regular CBC, which is a complete blood count. That's a very easy thing to do. Typically, we'll see some changes on that tell us, okay, this could be a mold problem because it's starting to create immune deficiency. I also check liver enzymes because mold toxins are liver toxins. So if we see somebody that before the exposure had a lower level and then their liver enzymes start to rise, they may be, I tell a case in my book that there's this patient of mine that was blamed for being an alcoholic and he had never touched a drop of alcohol. But his doctor was sure he was an alcoholic because he had this liver enzyme that was high. And he was like, help me, Dr. Jill, I'm not an alcoholic. And it turned out he had mold toxin sickness. I will also look at a stool test if there are a lot of gut problems. And then there's something called an organic acids test. That's the urine test could be done at the same time as the mycotoxin. And that tells us if the person has if yeast has now become a secondary problem that we have to knock back even more aggressively. And it also tells me what their detox status is with glutathione. So I know if I need to be helping things out a little bit. I talk about in treatment, we really have to protect the body from all these toxins before we go poking the bear.
How, you hear people for 50 years now, I've heard of yeast infections and people having yeast infections. How does that different? Is that different from a mold sickness or is it similar? Or I'm just not that familiar with yeast infections.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. I think that mold and yeast are different critters, but mold and mold toxins reduce the body's immune system and wear down the lining of the intestines and the sinuses. You can have yeast infections in the sinuses. It can destroy that barrier, and then the yeast can take over. And it's just like an opportunistic infection. We all, healthy people, have candida and have these yeasts in our body, but mold exposure degrading the lining and reducing our defenses allows Candida to take a stronger foothold than it should. So not everybody with mold sickness has Candida. Not everybody with Candida has mold, but we see them together quite a bit.
Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about treatment. And, we're going to run a little short on time. So if we could kind of get an overview of your treatment protocol, and then maybe we'll spend the last 15 minutes or so talking about inspection and remediation of indoor environments.
Sure. So my treatment, I call it peeling the orange. And I had to come up with something that we do every day that enough people understand. There are two things that need to be done 100%. So that's peeling the outer orange layer and that white fluffy layer of the orange. And those things are fundamentals and avoidance. Avoidance being the number one. Like Dr. Crinian taught me, the first 3 treatments for any toxic illness are avoidance, avoidance, avoidance. That's how important avoidance is. So if you think about it, we have so many people who try to negotiate. I'm sure you guys see it a lot. IEPs see it all the time. People try to negotiate with you that mold isn't as big a problem as you're saying it is. Maybe it doesn't need to be removed. Maybe we don't need to leave the house while we're remediating. They're negotiating all the time. And I think that's mold's Jedi mind trick. When I take the 10,000 foot view between Lyme and mold, both very debilitating diseases, Lyme needs you alive. Lyme is a parasite and it needs you alive. Mold would love to decompose you. So it doesn't need you alive. So in my viewpoint of treatment, mold is the chief. We got to take care of that. So avoidance of that exposure is number one, and I'm very pushy and strict about that. People's stuff takes on mycotoxins and particulate, spores, and they underestimate the negative health effects of this critter. So avoidance, and then fundamentals are things that are just like naturopathic basic treatment things. You go to a naturopathic doctor and they're going to talk to you about all the things we talked about earlier. So you've got the outer 2 layers are avoidance, fundamentals, and then the juicy inside, the sections where you get to pick and choose the tools that work for you are protect, repair, and fight. So meaning that once you're out of the mold and the avoidance is 100%, you've done the fundamentals, which is foods that are naturally high in their binding capability, foods that are protective of the body, getting on a circadian rhythm, because mold will mess that up. It makes people night owls, which is kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So you get on that circadian rhythm, you get breathing, you get hydrating with the right kind of water. The water that mold sick people need is spring water, things that have a lot of solute in them to try to trap that water in, because they don't make, Dr. Shoemaker was the first one to talk about this. They don't make the hormone that holds water in the body. So you have to do it with kind of salty water. Water that's from a spring has more mineral salts in it. So you get those fundamentals, and then protect, repair, and fight. That can then be picked and choose which tool you choose based on how you're affected by mold. So protect would be things like really high dose good fats. Mold toxins are fat soluble. So you need to dilute those toxins with good fats. So Dr. Crinian also taught was the solution to pollution is dilution. So you don't just dilute with water. In the case of a fat toxin illness, you dilute with fats. So I have people go on very high dose of good fats and then high bioflavonoids. So those are things that are going to protect the liver and the kidneys and help with detoxification, protect the heart, protect those membranes we talked about that get shrunk down and degraded. It protects the brain, protects the eyes. The eyes get hit really hard with mold. And then protects the nervous system. So the combination of good fats and bioflavonoids helps to protect the body and preserve the immune system and nervous system so you can make good decisions about how to remediate your house. And then there are certain plants and certain nutrients that we use to target the weak system. Mold will accentuate your weakness. So it might be something where you need a little more support for your heart. It might be that you need a little more support for bladder. Maybe you're running to the bathroom all the time. So we can pick and choose that repair tool to try to set the stage. And I learned by making mistakes, you don't start poking the bear of the fungal burden in the body until you have all those things laid down and in place. Because once you start poking at mold, it was found that Aspergillus that was exposed to amphotericin B kicked up its production of mycotoxins. So you actually it will feel threatened, and mold's response to feeling threatened is to make more toxin. So I don't start on antifungals until I have those things laid down. And then in my experience, you need to treat systemically with antifungals to knock the fungal burden down. That's going to be in the gut mostly. And then use sinus treatment antifungals to try to knock back that fungal overburden as well. Because low-grade fungal sinusitis is a massive problem with mold illness.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah,
That's the nutshell.
All right. Let me ask a couple follow-ups. Binding foods. Can you give me an example of some binding foods?
Yes. I went to research on people who have had their gallbladder removed to get this information. So the reason we talk about binding in mold sickness is that those toxins get packaged up in bile and then carried into the intestine to be pooped out. But unfortunately, in the case of toxic diseases, we recycle over 90% of that bile. So you're just going to recycle that toxin back into the liver, and it has to reprocess it over again. So it's sort of this definition of insanity, that I already saw that toxin. Why did you bring it to me again? And the system is meant to help us preserve our fat-soluble nutrients like vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E. But it unfortunately also recycles these toxins back through like a radiator kind of. So the idea is that when that bile comes into the intestine, we want things that will grab it more aggressively than other foods or regular food. So when I went to the research to find what are the things that are proven to help people who've had their gallbladder out, because those people have too much bile coming into their intestines and they need that bile to be sopped up by something. And the research is showing us that steamed or cooked kale is very effective for that. So it's so cool that we can give someone a food that also nourishes vitamin A and vitamin C. Kale is one of the highest nutrient foods for vitamin A and vitamin C, and at the same time make them better from this mold toxicity. And then there are other binders you can use therapeutically. But the danger with using binders for too long is that, remember, the purpose of that recycling is to keep our fat-soluble nutrients. So if you have someone on really intense binders for a long time, then they're going to become deficient in these nutrients that are the fat solubles and also the nutrients we use to make bile. So sometimes rather than put someone on a binder, I'll put them on steamed kale, or there are other binders that I'll use, and I will have them take something that moves the bile more to try to get them, when they're plants, they can get that bile moving more in a nourishing way that still feeds glycine and taurine and all these little nutrients that we make bile out of.
Why steamed or cooked versus raw?
That was just what they found in the studies, that it bound more bile.
Okay.
So yeah, again, like I'm in this position of translational medicine. I have to go out, and I have who doesn't have a comfort with kale? It's not like their only limitation with too much kale is that it can be high in thallium. It's a good chelator of soil. So if the soil was bad that it was grown in, but other than that, there aren't really harms to eating kale. And so I'm out there looking in the research. What are the things I'm comfortable with? What are things that are working for other applications with this same body system or body fluid?
Okay. What's a example of good fats?
Good fats. So olive oil, avocado, fats from nuts like walnuts. You want to have the walnuts still in the shell, because that will preserve the fat and keep it from oxidizing and keep it from getting moldy. So you can, it's kind of fun, sit around the table with your family and everybody's, it's Christmas time too. It's time to do this, cracking nuts and eating and playing cards. And so you're nourishing your brain. Fish is also a good place for good fats. So sometimes we will need to, therapeutically, we need to put people on very high dose fish oil to get that. You can eat it too.
There you go. And now let me get, this is one that really intrigues me because I've had my own sinus issues for years. What are the sinus treatments that you recommend? I mean, I've always used a neti pot, or now I've got the lavage thing, and that seems to be, helpful to some degree. What else is good?
Yeah, there's so many things that you can do for the sinuses. And again, not everybody is going to be able to tolerate one treatment over another. So on my list of things, my favorite is essential oils. The reason I love them is they're antifungal and they neutralize mycotoxins. So you're getting a double whammy for that. Not everybody can tolerate them because they are also high in aldehydes, which is what mold secretes in normal metabolism. So sometimes that's just too much aldehyde for somebody. But I have a video out on YouTube, and it's called the DIY Essential Oil Nasal Spray, and you can make your own. Make sure that you're starting from sterile water, so you're not adding more critters up into that into that war zone. But you can start with a very low amount of essential oils, make your own, and using that 2 times a day. I also love Manuka honey added to either a neti pot. It is kind of gooey, so you have to warm the water ahead of time to get the Manuka to mix in. You can add that to a neti pot, and honey is fungistatic, meaning it's stopping fungus from growing more. And it also, if you have a lot of really irritated respiratory passages and sinus, essential oils probably sound like I'm like a torture treatment. Then you can go to the honey instead and do something more soothing. Yeah, so you can use ozone in the sinuses. Dr. Neil Nathan, in his book, he has information on how to do that. That does take a doctor to make the ozone or ozone generator, but it's very effective. So there's tons of things that you can do in the sinuses. My new favorite, peppermint is pretty strong. I don't know that you're really getting a lot of anti-mold activity. It's definitely opening things up because it's a volatile oil. But I don't think there are other things that you could do that have mold, like eucalyptus, that we know have studies that it kills mold and neutralizes mycotoxins. And if anybody wants the essential oils are in my book, but I'm happy to share that information. I can take a picture of it in my book. If they just email me, and I can share with you the essential oils that are good for killing mold. I talk through which ones those are in the video, but sometimes it's nice to have just a list. Yeah, I want to share, people need these tools.
Well, the wider array of tools in your toolbox, the more chance you have of finding what works for you, I think. And, I know, for instance, the kale, I'm big on kale and fish and, what about tea tree oil? Do you ever use tea tree oil for any kind of treatment?
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, it can be a little irritating. So that's where I mix it in with the other essential oils. Like a lot of times I will use eucalyptus, thyme, and then I kind of spike it with a little tea tree and make that into a nasal spray. Yeah, tea tree is amazing. And I'm just now consulting with a company on a product for sinus treatment that I'm really hoping our we're just doing our own clinical studies on people, but I'm really hoping that it bears out as being effective and gentle. Because that's one of the problems I'm seeing with essential oils is while they're very effective, they can be a little too caustic for people or have those chemicals that people are already sick with. So I'm hoping to have some more information and tools for people as we go along.
All right. We've got about 6 minutes left. I know it's a little short on time for discussion of inspection and remediation, but can you give some key points, some key tips for doing assessment, for IEPs doing assessment out there, how what are the types of things you suggest they look for, and then maybe a point or two on remediation.
Well, the good news is I don't have a whole lot to say because I'm a body expert, not a building expert. The building expertise that I've gained has been with working with Martine Davis, who's in our area, very gifted inspector. She's pretty much taught me everything I know and has been gracious to spend a lot of hours on the phone with me saying, yeah, but what about this? What about this? The way I come at this is after working with very sick and sensitive people, going through their remediations. I work with my patients very holistically. And I think that, as an IEP, the more holistic you can be, the better. As a naturopathic doctor, I see everyone as an individual. And every building is an individual as well. Every building has its own story, it has its history, of water damage or no water damage. It has its history of, who knows what water damage events in the house. So I look for IAPs that are more holistic, because I think that they're also understanding that when you're working with a mold sick person, you're working with somebody who's pretty sensitive. And to be able to trust when a person says, I don't feel good here, and I don't know why. Can you guys figure it out? And now my patients know this about me. I'm kind of a mold canary. So they'll say, can you come for the inspection and come sniff my house and tell them where to make sure to take a sample? So I think that, and interestingly enough, a lot of times that is where we find this hidden problem, that who knew that, there was 2 layers of subfloor and the water took a trip down 1 layer and it ended up, 10 feet down where you wouldn't think it was coming down the wall. So I think trust the people that live in the space. They're going to seem very hypochondriacal, but they're just really sick, and their bodies are telling them where the problem is. So what I've learned in my years of helping with patients with remediations, the most successful and the ones that don't need to be done are when more material was cut than less. So, with that, at the time that I was working with like real deep remediation, our remediators were taking, 2 feet past visual damage, and those were the most successful. So I try to warn patients that I'm working with to say, tell your remediation company, that your inspector wants this remediation. Make sure that they're willing to work with your inspector, work as a team, help everybody be accountable to keep you the most healthy that you can be through this process and end up with a healthy house you can move back into. So I really just rely on a good inspector, and I let them drive the bus from there. And I try to do the ancillary, keep my patient together, and support them from my end, from all the things I can do to support. So taking more than you think, though, is really important. So that's one thing I counsel my patients: make sure that you're asking for an extra day on the remediation than they think they need. Pay for it. Buy the guys lunch, because they're working in hot suits with respirators and putting their own health on the line to help you. So pay for an extra day so that nobody's rushed and they can take more material out than they think that they have to. Because I think standard is that, you spray it with some kind of mold killing spray. And I've done my own experiments with this one in my own house. And while some of those sprays might work in a research situation, once you get into a unique pathogenic biofilm environment in a house, I've now done this on multiple houses, where I've asked the remediators to do their treatment and their spray, and I'm going to do pre and post testing. And we ended up with 2 extra species of mold on that treated wood. So there's something that happens when you're in that pathogenic biofilm environment. So I want to make sure that people are understanding where to best apply spray, where, and when to best take it out. And I'm looking forward to more research on your end too, and for us as doctors to get educated. Because right now we're just, But there's so many tools. We need to all be sharing. I love that you're doing this radio show, because then we all share and we know that each of the tools are out there have a perfect application. So let's use it for that application.
It's a lot of it is removal of particulate. Carl Grimes was on a while back. He called it demon dust, and that was not his direct quote. He stole it from someone else, but I think he's accurate. The more dust we can get out, the better. Cliff, I want to turn it over to you for any follow-up questions or comments you may have.
I just have one. Doctor, you mentioned unhappy and happy biofilms, and I was just wondering if you could give us an example of a happy biofilm.
Happy biofilm we normally have in our gut and sinuses. We call it the microbiome. We're finding that that's so much more than just what bacteria you have living there. It has to do with what fungus are living there, and we have some parasites that are travelers through that induce certain kinds of immune boosting effects. So a healthy body is basically the result of a healthy biome. And that's what I think of as our biofilm. The whole lining of our intestines and our sinuses, our respiratory passages, have these symbiotic and helpful critters. Even though Candida's there, even though some of these other guys that become opportunistic infections. So trying to make sure that the right critters in the right space in the right proportion, and that things are working symbiotically to share information about the body to help the immune system stay strong and keep the barriers up. Pathogenic, then everybody starts acting on their own for themselves, kind of like Americans. That, we've kind of lost that community thing where we are all lifted up by the whole.
The trivia question, did you get a correct answer?
Oh, yeah, we always do. We have world's smartest audience. It takes them seconds.
Let us know. What was the correct answer?
Oh, the correct answer was in 1962, following the deaths of 100,000 young turkey poults in the UK, the term was first used.
Very good.
I mean, I've got a whole history of it. We have really, really smart people. John Lapotaire got it today. Doug Conan added a bunch of information. They typically get it, within a minute or whatever. It's amazing. Smart people.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Jill Crista, anything you'd like to add before we wrap it up? I really enjoyed having you and enjoyed the conversation. It's great to see other people that are working to try and figure this puzzle out.
Yeah, I don't think I really do. If anyone wants, I have a ton of video blogs out there. If I learn something new or if I get enough of the same question, I'll shoot off a video. They're a minute or less, so they're really easy to digest. It's like mold junk food. So that's on my website on video blogs, also on YouTube. So, and if people have questions, they can send me an email and I'll try to do a video blog on it. I know my perspective and my way of coming at this is different than what a lot of people have heard. So I'm excited to have the opportunity to talk about it.
Oh, and it's great. We're excited to have you and great way to finish out the year. We will have a blog that will go out probably after the holidays. I don't know, Cliff. We'll see. Maybe I can get it out on Tuesday because that would be a good piece of reading for people over the holidays. So Cliff will send it to you, and then you can take a look at it, make sure everything's okay, and we'll get it out for our listeners. We're going to take a couple weeks off for the holidays. We'll be back, I believe, the second Friday in January with the next episode of IAQ Radio. I want to thank Dr. Jill Crista for joining us. I want to thank my co-host, the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick, and, of course, at the controls, John. You got to have faith. Most importantly, our growing group of loyal listeners, and we'll see you all. Have a great holiday, and Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year, and all that fun stuff. We'll see you in a couple of weeks with the next episode of IAQ Radio Plus.
For IAQ Radio, I'm Spike Reed saying thanks for listening.